أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers. Welcome back to Islamic Oasis Live. Alhamdulillah, today I'm very honored to have Dr. Safaruk Chowdhury back on here again for the second part of this two-part, who knows, maybe three-part video series regarding the works of Shaykh Yusuf Nabhani. The title of this podcast series is called In the Twilight of Osman's Dream. Osman here is referring, of course, to Osman I, the founder of the Ottoman Empire, of the Uthmani Khilafah. So, to kind of lay the groundwork here, the reason why this title is named like this is Twilight. It's like, it's the ending time of the day. It's like close to Maghrib. So the scholar that we're talking about today, if you remember from the first part, Shaykh Yusuf Nabhani, he was living at kind of the tail end of the Ottoman Empire. So at this point, we're talking about the late 19th century of the Common Era. At this point, unfortunately, many areas of the Muslim world have saw colonialism in the Maghrib in North Africa with France and Italy, in India and South Asia by the British. One of the last major Islamic empires or sultanates or khilafah, you can use whichever term there, but the Ottomans are the ones that are basically the last ones standing, and the way that they're standing is on a troubled footing. At this time, you have various movements that are trying to reimagine not just the Ottoman Empire, what it should be, whether it should be a caliphate, whether it should be a nationalist state. You also have people that are going to the very fundamentals of how Muslims view themselves and their deen. So the works of Shaykh Yusuf Nabhani will find that he is kind of coming from for lack of a better word, and hopefully we can get into the kind of baggages that are in these terms that we're using here. Shaykh Yusuf Nabhani, you can say he's kind of from a traditionalist Sunni kind of Sufi background. And a lot of his works focus on this reformist scholars that are gaining a lot of traction at this time. You might know this trio of Jamaluddin al-Afghani, Muhammad Abduh, and Rashid Rida. So one of the things that, inshallah, we'd like to address here, inshallah, we can hop into the conversation. But it's even though we're talking about events that happened a little bit more than 100 years ago, on this discussion of reformists and traditionalists, these terms, like I was saying before, they can carry a lot of baggage, but for convenience, I'm just using them here. One of the questions, inshallah, we want to address is whether it's accurate that traditionalists were unaware of the problems that the Muslim world faced. So part of the reason why reformists had gained such a wide audience at this time is because they brought awareness to contemporary issues that the Muslim world was facing, such as colonization and the lack of technological development. Additionally, they appeared to call to an authentic revival of the Muslim world through a return to base sources like the Quran and the Sunnah. However, when they advocated this, many times they smuggled in a problematic hermeneutic and epistemology and posited it as the only solution for surviving in a changing world. Traditionalists have long been portrayed as out of touch and partisan to Sunnism for emotional reasons. However, is this depiction, inshallah we'll discuss this question, is this depiction a reflection of our own internalized modernity? Nabhani, along with many ulama till today, didn't advocate for a traditionalist understanding of Islamic sciences because of a blind adherence to dogma, like is popularly said today. But it's rather because he argued it was an accurate representation of the most successful Muslim generation. We're talking about the Sahaba and the ones came after. Even you can argue for hundreds of years, centuries afterwards, they were also on this same understanding. They also argued that this traditionalist way of looking at the deen, of understanding Islam and the way of life of Islam, was dynamic enough to be applied at all places and times. Clearly, Nabhani, as we discussed in the first part, he was not ignorant of the issues that were plaguing the Muslim world at this time, because he had worked very heavily with the last well-known Ottoman Khalifa, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, or one of the last, rather, I should, if I'm being more accurate, who had made a really big push for Pan-Islamism and a unity underneath the Ottoman Caliphate. So the questions that we want to kind of address here is how did these two political visions differ between the traditionalists and the reformists? How is this related to their fundamental understandings of Islam and of knowledge of epistemology? And what can we gain from looking at this debate today? How is this debate relevant to us today? So, alhamdulillah, I have the good honor of welcoming Dr. Chowdhury to the podcast. Welcome, Dr. Chowdhury. It's always glad to have you back.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And thanks for having me for this part two. I mean, you have summarized, you've contextualized our discussion really, really well. You know, you've anchored our time period. We're looking at the 19th century mainly, especially, from the mid 19th century to early 20th century. You've sketched some of the tensions, challenges, and so I think the points that you mention in my discussion, I'll try and thread out, the important points that you mentioned. And so, I mean, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. As I said, it's really, really, it's great to be on. I ask Allah to accept the amazing work that you're doing at the center, online, in person. And, I pray that Allah takes from strength to strength, gives you all tawfiq, and makes you a benefit, a beacon for the Muslim community. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen.
Ameen wa iyyakum.
Yeah, you talked about sort of traditionalist reformists, and I know many people may not like those terms, reformists, or modernists is another term that's used, right? And perhaps that's the kind of word that I'm going to be using, but I'll use reformists, those who wanted to adapt Islam. None of the modernists wanted to change Islam in the sense of trying to change the deen, right? But they wanted to try and make the deen applicable and relevant. And how they do that, inshallah, maybe I'll try and mention some points about that. And then, so reformists and modernists. So modernists, I'm going to use the term because of how I want to unpack this term modernism, because this is the time period, the historical period in which we are situating all these actors, these individuals, and all these tensions. So I want to say something about that. Okay. So onto your sort of,
can I ask something real quick? I think this will be a good thing for the rest of the discussion. So modernists, you're saying, just so we get our points clear, our terms clear. So modernist, you're saying, is somebody who's basically trying to reconstitute the Muslim world. So this is somebody who maybe they're trying to do tajdid, or we're talking about somebody who is having the goal of they want to be a mujaddid, basically somebody reviving Muslim way of life, Islamic way of life. So that would be a reformist. But a modernist would be somebody who is kind of functioning within the episteme of a modern way of life. What does that mean, modernity?
Oh, okay.
Just so we can get this type of
So reform. See, for me, I'm using the word modernism broadly, and I'll try and explain some features as I understand that relates to Islamic modernism. But reform is an aspect, as I see it, an aim of Muslim modernists. Yeah. Okay. So for me, reform I see is more of a kind of aim behind kind of that whole Islamic modernism approach.
Okay.
And so before we even get to the Islamic sort of term, we need to know what modernism is, right? So I'm for the way, though I may use them interchangeably, I don't like to use them interchangeably. So, I don't want to use reform because it's an aspect of Islamic modernism in general. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
so if let me tell you what the features I think are of Islamic modernism, and then what I'll have to do is then I'll have to explain what is specifically about modernism that the Islamic modernists adopted, right? So for me, the aims of Islamic modernists are those who encountered modernity, this new, set of ideas, this historical period that, is born out of the Enlightenment. And we talked about that, I think, this in the first episode. The way I understand modernists, their aim is what you mentioned at the beginning: reform and revival or rejuvenation, tajdeed. So their aim was to rejuvenate Islamic societies by addressing the sort of social, political, economic issues, right? But through the lens of modernity, but staying true to what they felt were the core values of Islam, the essential values of Islam. The other aim was to harmonize Islamic teachings, the mabadi', the principles, with the contemporary developments at the time, like science, technology, rational thought. Yeah. The other aim was educational advancement. This is one of the things that Shaykh Yusuf al-Nabhani attacked quite severely, because what Muslim modernists wanted to do was promote modern education that included scientific, technical knowledge, alongside a kind of reformed religious sort of curriculum. Yeah. So Nabhani was staunch against Western schools, for example. Yeah, and allowing Western schools to be,
Just real
present
quick.
within.
Could
Yeah,
we get like a definition for, again, these terms, they have a lot of baggage with them, but we see a lot, like a lot of papers I read, like it referred to Yusuf Nabhani as kind of a traditionalist scholar. So like, would you use this term, or like how would you
yeah.
describe
I'm going
him?
to do it. I'm going to lay out the features of traditionalist scholars as well.
Okay.
After I lay out the sort of yeah. That way we've got a juxtaposition.
All right.
Even though we did a bit of it last session, but I'll do that again. Let me go through some of the core sort of features or identifications for what I'm taking to be Islamic modernism. So I mentioned reform and revival. I mentioned adaptation to modernity, which I'm going to explain what modernity is and what is, as I see it, what is the most defining thing of modernity that Muslim modernists at the time, so we're talking about the 19th century, adopted, right? So adaptation to modernity, we've got the educational advancement, right? And then we've got political reform. And so modernists, one of their aims was to encourage governance systems that reflected democratic principles, human rights, that were, though it was emerging differently at the time, but, the kind of discourse around politics that was coming out of Western metropolises and Western centers of learning, or what was brought by colonialism, and modernists wanted to show how Islam was compatible with these principles, these governance principles. So justice, equality, democracy, things like that. And then you've got social justice, addressing issues like gender, what we would call now gender, social welfare, economic justice, things like that. So those, as I see it, were their sort of broad aims. Renewal, rejuvenating Islamic societies, trying to adapt Islam to them within a and fit it in the modern context. Another aim is educational, promotion of modern education, political reform, and social justice. What was their assumptions? What was the modernist assumptions? Some of the assumptions, as I see it, was that Islam was compatible with any age, and that includes the modern age. And if the modern age is defined by science, technology, and rationality, then Islam is compatible with that. Another assumption they had was, and again, I'll go to the source of this, the parent. I believe the parent of these assumptions is this kind of idea of sort of a dynamic interpretation of Islamic sources, scriptural sources. The assumption that the Islamic texts and teachings are not static, they're not fixed and immutable, but they can be interpreted in light of changing circumstances. A third assumption is to do with rationality and reason. Muslim modernists, as I see them, emphasize the use of reason and rationality in understanding Islam and applying Islamic teaching. So there is an emphasis on rationality and reason. That moves away from scripture. That moves away from authority. And here, when I mean authority, I mean ulama, the madahib, books of fiqh. You see? And then lastly, the assumption of universality, ethical universality. That, Islamic ethical principles can be universally applicable, and they can address issues on a global scale, right? So these are some of the sort of core identifications. Now, on the point about hermeneutics that you mentioned at the beginning, in your sort of opening sort of position statement, that the reformists, they were calling to an authentic sort of revival and modification, change, rejuvenation, whatever that might be, whatever term we might use. But you said something like they smuggled in problematic hermeneutics and sort of a problematic epistemology, right? As far as I remember.
Yeah.
And this, again, will go back to the parent idea that they adopt or approach. So modernist hermeneutics or interpretive method focuses on contextual interpretation. So Islamic texts are interpreted in light of the historical and cultural context, and we derive relevant meanings for contemporary issues, via contextual readings. We don't go to the books of fiqh, right? You got this kind of critical method to understand the development of Islam and Islamic theology, Islamic law and Islamic theology over time.
So it's like so just like as a short digression here. So like that would obviously the Muslim world as time went on, people are dealing with different circumstances and things like that. So how does this just so we can make everything clear, so the way the modernists might have differed from more traditionalist methods, from my understanding, would be traditionalists, those adhering to the four madahib, for example. The kind of primacy and the reason why they would adhere to these madahib is because they had their hermeneutic is basically, and hermeneutic meaning the way they're understanding the text, such as the Quran and hadith and things like this, texts. So their understanding would be rooted in basically an understanding which has a consensus from this early generation. And for example, I can tell you maybe a little bit about from the Hanafi school perspective, right? Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, he is basically the student of a line of ulama which is essentially leading back to Abdullah ibn Masud radiallahu anhu. So what Hanafis might say is they'd say that the understanding of Imam Abu Hanifa is indicative of what was the understanding of his teachers leading back to Abdullah ibn Masud. So this is the reason why they would form the school around the principles of understanding the texts that Imam Abu Hanifa had basically taught his students. So that's kind of this difference between more of a traditionalist type of understanding, that they want to understand the text in the context of that, the way the meanings and the approach of this earlier generation, while modernists would be more open to understanding the text in light of certain circumstances. Am I getting that right? Like the circumstances are
Yeah,
basically the
definitely.
determinant there, rather than
No, you're right.
yeah.
You're right. And this might be a good way then, though I've given you a basic sketch of some of the features of what I take to be Islamic modernism. That, you mentioned, the point that you mentioned will allow a good way for us to identify some markers of traditionalist scholars like Shaykh Yusuf and al-Nabhani radiallahu an.
Mm,
So they would be, so the traditionalist camp will be identified with more sort of a conservative approach where there are defined roles, not only between men and women, but defined roles in society. There's this idea of preserving the established intellectual tradition that includes the interpretations and practices from those traditions, whether that's the legal interpretations or um, spiritual interpretations and practices. So tasawwuf.
mm,
They they were adamant on adhering to and maintaining authority, intellectual authority, a tradition that was based on scholars and scholars before those scholars and scholars before those scholars, going back to the ideal Salaf Salih, the ideal generation which the Prophet blessed. And they want to sustain, they want to maintain all the intellectual sciences and disciplines that had sustained the Muslim community for centuries.
mm.
They want to maintain and preserve that. And they wanted to preserve all the theoretical apparatus needed for those sciences.
Yeah, and there's a bit of like,
And they
kind
believe that
of yeah, go ahead.
usul al-fiqh.
Mm.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go on.
There's a bit of like, kind of schools of kalam as well in there, right? Like and that, like, the Ashari and Maturidis and the Hanbalis, nominatively. So like yeah, this kind of general idea of uh what is like possible, like kind of like a metaphysics. What is, like, a proper way to understand, the texts that are there in the Quran. For example, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that He split the sea from Musa alayhi salam. Is this
Mm.
like obviously this is not like, a normal thing that happens, but it's not like explained away just because it's not something which would happen normally. It's explained through
Yeah,
majazat, and
that's
there's rational
theology. Yeah.
explanation too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. That's more theology. So they would consider, the traditionalists would consider the theology, pre-modern theology, ilm al-kalam, um, and those who are not kalam inclined, actually, like
Mm,
scriptural theologians, uh, like the Salafis, so the Wahhabi ulama that follow the manhaj, the methodology of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, um, who morphed into the Salafis in the 50s, 60s, 70s until now. They are also traditionalists, but
mm.
they wouldn't adhere to a rationalist theology like the Kalam approach, right?
Okay. So you're talking
So
about in like fiqh, in like law, for example,
yeah,
or
they would as well. So
yeah.
even Wahhabis, yeah, those who follow that manhaj of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, they would follow, madhahib al-dhab, although though some had different tendencies, emphasizing ijtihad and so on. But traditionalists in general, wherever they are on the spectrum, they have an adherence towards tradition. There must not be a rupture from tradition, because one of the aspects of modernity is, and by entailment, one of the aspects of Islamic modernists is their rupture, their break from tradition. So they are discontinuous.
Hmm.
And I'll be able to explain that better when I explain modernity and one of the key babies born out of modernity, Western modernity. So
Yeah.
Islamic traditionalists are conservative. They want to they want to preserve the established intellectual traditions and the interpretations and practices that came out of those interpretations, those disciplines and subjects. They believe that that the solutions to the modern problems that the Muslim world was facing lay established framework of that traditional Islamic knowledge. So the traditional methodologies set down by ulama, going all the way back to the first Muslim generation of Salaf al-Salih, this is the most effective way to achieve societal success and stability. And so the interpretations, the theoretical apparatus, everything that came from the tradition must be preserved. And by rupturing, by breaking ourselves away from the tradition is actually is to destabilize Muslims. And this is why Shaykh Yusuf al-Nabhani supported, and this is why traditionalists supported the Dawla Uthmaniyya, the Uthmaniyya Khilafah. One, because they saw the Khalifa, the Sultan, as legitimate, but it was necessary for unity and stability of the Muslim Ummah. Now, and by you trying to politically reform, which the modernists were trying to do, what you are doing is you're destabilizing the Muslim Ummah. So the traditionalist vision was rooted in maintaining continuity with the past, while and that meant ensuring that the Islamic principles were not diluted by these modern accretions or modern influences. Right? So Imam Yusuf al-Nabhani saw, the modernists, traditionalists, they were all living through the impact of modernity. So he saw the Ottoman Khilafah as a legitimate authority, providing political stability and that unity to the Muslim world. And so by having that Khilafah, by ensuring that there was a unified Muslim polity under a legitimate Khalifa, this was crucial for defending against these external threats from outside and internal discord. Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit what was the kind of relationship between the Uthmani sultans and and the ulama? Because sultan is just we've had good sultans, we've had bad sultans, right? So why did the ulama really go behind the Khalifa or the Sultan of this time, Abdul Hamid II? What's the kind of working relationship? Did they have a working relationship? What was it like?
Ulama generally, historically, even now, held various roles anyway in society. Whether that ranged from accounting the ruler to advising the ruler or guiding the community in matters of faith and law, right? This is what the ulama do. But one of the main reasons why the ulama, under the Uthmaniyya territories, the reason why they wanted to do that was by supporting a centralized Muslim authority. This would be seen as a bulwark against sort of fragmentation and then subjugation. If you're divided, you're going to be conquered and subjugated.
Okay.
So by supporting the centralized Muslim authority in the form of the Khalifa, you are then maintaining unity. You're enabling a unified front against colonial powers that were open to they're open in their hatred for destroying the Islamic political authority and fragmenting the Ummah. And they didn't hide that.
Yeah.
And so this is why the Sultan, wanted to sell the idea, Sultan Abdul Hamid at the time, to sell the idea of the Pan-Islamic political project.
And in a certain way,
by maintaining.
Go ahead.
I was just saying. So that project was to unite Muslims across the territories under a single leadership and governance structure in the form of the Khilafah Uthmaniyya. This would then, like I said, allow that unified presence against colonial powers and from fragmenting the Ummah. And so, Pan-Islamic ideas, were this sort of means of unifying the Muslim Ummah and reclaiming some kind of political power and identity. And so the ulama were behind that, because Pan-Islamism, transcended ethnic, national, sectarian divisions, because ulama were worried that the creeping nationalism was going to fragment the Ummah. But by having a supra-national entity, you could have a global, you could address the political, economic, social challenges facing the Muslim world at the time. So that meant getting behind the Khalifa, taking him as a legitimate Khalifa, and then, putting him forward as the unifying figure.
So I feel like this is one of those things that today, this is where kind of looking at the past can help us understand some of the things that we hear today. Yes. And some of the literature that I was reading, and it's easy to see people will say that like, oh, Pan-Islamism, it failed because it was just not a natural idea. Some people have taken this stance that it was too much of a big project to unite people of all different ethnicities. They had too many differences. Even if they say they're all Muslim, everybody has their own Islam native to their own area, and everybody understands it completely differently. While that's a pretty contentious claim, even for researchers that are talking about that time period. They had sent the Ottoman Empire had sent intelligence gathering missions, which is very interestingly, they wanted to, in this time period where it's a really time of crisis, the Uthmanis, they sent out a lot of da'is and diplomats to far-flung places across the Muslim world, India and to Nigeria, Sokoto, and nominally most of the time what they found was most of the people, they had this love affinity for the idea of a Khalifa, for the idea of united Muslim leadership. I mean, This is not really the idea, we call it Pan-Islamism in this time, right? But if you want to go back in history into the time of the Abbasids, let's say, for example, right? During the time of the Abbasids, early on, you had different Muslim empires that were fighting with each other. You had groups like the Khawarij. You had different people who are vying for power. So I mean, when this idea of kind of Jama' comes into the Ahlul Sunnah part, where it's now, people are calling themselves Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'. We are not going to make takfir on the people of the Qibla. We're not going to go again, if the leader is basically a Muslim and he's implementing the deen, then we should still not engage in an armed rebellion. Some of the ulama, they held this position, right? So I mean, is that a pan-Islamist type of idea? This idea of Jama', that the Muslim Ummah should be united under a single leadership. That's something interesting to think about, because if we're going to look at this period and say, oh, well, it didn't work out, the Ottoman Empire fell apart either way, then it's you can't just connect the idea of a Islamic unity to the Ottoman Empire itself falling, and then just say that that was contextualized for that time period only, and it didn't work out. Which many people, they'll...
though, even after the fall, you're right, and even after the fall of the Ottomans, the heirs, as they call it, to the Pan-Islamist vision still lives on. And what does it live on? It lives on in the idea that the Muslim Ummah is looking for global union under a single leadership. So the Pan-Islamism vision is the heirs of that vision, or that policy or that idea. It is resurfacing in the idea of global union, the Ummah being unified globally under a singular leadership, a singular Islamic authority. And this is where we've got the idea of the restoration project, i.e. restoring the Khilafah. Why? To address the common challenges that we have now to Islam and to counter the external threats to Islam and Muslims, particularly from Western, neo-colonial Western, for several decades. So it's almost central, but coming back again a century later, the idea that the Ummah seems to be shuffling towards the idea of that Islamic singular authority, that kind of restoration project. Now, how that restoration will take place, that's a different discussion, because people differ over how you are going to get that singular leadership, how are you going to realize that global union. That, of course, is a different. But traditionalists are in favor. Well, traditionalists, true heirs to those traditionalists, like heirs of Yusuf al-Nabhani, would want that global union. Would want that global union. And so, in a sense, you could say, and people can accept this characterization or they can reject it. In a sense, you could say those who are seeking that global union again, i.e. are part of the restoration project, i.e. bringing back or restoring the Khilafah again, Islamic singular, political leadership, they are the heirs of, Shaykh Yusuf al-Nabhani. You what you mentioned is important. Another thing you mentioned that I wanted to pick up on, that you mentioned at the beginning, I think here is where I think to understand the modernists, because you mentioned, I think at the beginning, how is this debate between modernists, Islamic modernism and traditionalism relevant for today, right? Now. Before I kind of want to get your sort of thoughts as well on that, I wanted to sort of sketch out modernism. And I remember I mentioned, what is it particularly about modernism that is relevant for Islamic modernism? I characterize it, but I want to bring it to one unified parent. I want to give you the genealogy, its parent.
Okay.
And I want to just sketch that very quickly and get your thoughts on it.
Right.
Okay, so modernity, however you want to characterize it, right? This is part of what's known as the definitional puzzle. For those, who are historians would know. How do we define the Enlightenment and how do we define modernity? So which components are essential to modernity and which are like tangential? The way often many people understand modernity is modernity emerging exclusively out of this sort of binary relationship. So modernity is casting itself as an antithesis of a constructed other, whether that other is tradition or traditional or, religion, whatever it is, right?
So what's the relationship to
secular,
the other then?
So, for example, one of the aspects in which modernity, defines itself as in light of constructed other is one, it looks itself as not being under the sort of authority of religion. So secular. Yeah. Modernity, secular. How do we get there? It's constructed itself against religion. The other aspect of modernity is authority. And this is constructed from the other. The other here is tradition or traditional. So tradition is not an authority. Modernity, constructs itself as a rupture from the past. So it's not contiguous with the past. It's discontiguous. It breaks itself from the past. Why? Because the past is not an authority for itself. So like that. So modernity then is defined as the de-religionizing, or what they call the disenchantment, taking religion out, taking the supernatural out, the position of secular, where religion is now banished to the margins, this idea of authority, this idea of progression, whereas tradition and anything else is considered to be not progression, evolution, developing to become better and better. So all these kind of features of modernity, but what is it about modernity that I think is quite important? What is it that is what crucially is given birth to from modernity? And I think this is, or what's characteristic of modernity is historicism. Historicism. So historicism is like a paradigm shift in European sort of intellectual history. And it begins in the 19th century. And historicism is like a constellation of interrelated ideas, like progress, universalism, evolution. Here, I mean evolution, not in terms of Darwinian terms, but in terms of progress, right? To some kind of development that gets better and better.
Incremental
this idea of
development.
Yeah. This kind of idea of humanism, science. Now, according to historicism posits that each society is embedded in and reflective of its own particular historical context. These contexts are discrete, they're bounded, they're finite, they're spatially, temporally specific. They are anchored in space and time, and that space and time is bounded. So institutions, customs, practices, even interpretations are seen as products of their specific context. So when we historicize, according to historicism, what we mean is we want to reveal the positions, ideas, practices, and institutions within their historical context. What were the internal dynamics at that time? Yeah. So historicism involves that. Historicism involves recalibrating time as this kind of progressive development where civilization just progresses forward and becomes better and better.
If I can add something.
So human... Sorry?
Yeah, you can go ahead. But if I can add something, go ahead,
go.
And then I'll say after.
Okay, so according to historicism, human society progresses through sort of, civilizational levels. There might be primitive levels, and there's more advanced levels.
Yeah. So it's I think it's interesting to note that this is emerging out of the Enlightenment thinkers, right? All of the
yes.
This is emerging, and the Enlightenment, of course, one of the premier things about it is that it's a market shift in epistemology, in the way that people are going to understand the world, understand what is true, what is sound knowledge. So what emerges from this, if I'm remembering correctly, and hopefully you can correct me if I get something wrong, it's many of the Enlightenment thinkers, they pioneer empiricism, and they put it at the center of their worldview, saying that rational judgments cannot give sound proof, sound truths to a person. So instead, they should focus entirely on an empirical worldview, strictly using the scientific method as a way to incrementally increase your knowledge about a specific field. So that's something which emerged from, what we normally think about science today, right? Like chemistry and physics and maybe medicine and things like this. But now, like after the Enlightenment, more thinkers, they take it into the realm of philosophy, into the realm of political philosophy. Even the political philosophy comes from that period. Now they're viewing the human society as the subject of the experiment. So incrementally, step by step, how can people improve their conditions uh, according to what they think is, the most sound good or evil. The most sound good or evil in that empirical worldview would be what is giving a person more pleasure or pain. This can be something which is quantified. So in that way, like, people are taking steps the way they would, if correct me if I'm wrong, that kind of historicism worldview, that people live in simple societies and then they progress to more complicated societies, and there's like levels
It's
to
evolutionary
development.
progress, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Because
Happens
historicism,
incrementally.
as you rightly characterise, embraces this notion of evolutionary progress. Societies move through different stages of civilization. Why is that important? Because then it gives you a hierarchical understanding of cultures, and then you can place them
Mm.
in a continuum of development. So if the past cultures, they're on a continuum. Why do I want to be like the past when
Mm.
I'm on a continuum of development? I want to be now. You see, and what you mentioned, Zain, is very important about the scientific method, because that is the empirical part of historicism. Is this empirical historical criticism? Where you emphasize the use of empirical data, critical analysis. You reconstruct the past with this kind of information. You align your approach to the scientific method. You value impartiality and critical distance in your historical scholarship. So all the things that you mentioned fall under historicism for sure. But part of historicism as well, and I mentioned a few more. Then I'll mention why I think this is relevant to today, the traditionalism and Islamic modernism, and then how that's relevant to our current context. A
Mm.
few more aspects about historicism is this idea that when you make historical analysis of cultures, societies, and things like that, or even when you're just studying cultures in general and societies in general, historicism allows for the identification of essential timeless elements within religions and cultures and societies, and you distinguish them from what are called historical contingencies, i.e. what
Okay.
are
Okay.
accidental. Yeah.
Okay. So
Now,
it's not like
what does this
structuralist.
enable? Yeah, it could be, but here they're separating what versus context, you could say. So
Okay.
what the historicism method does is it allows you to reinterpret and recontextualize religion, culture, and societies, their practices, their beliefs. You can make a separation from what you think is essential to that religion, culture, and society, and what is merely historically accidental or contingent. Because
Okay.
whatever's accidental or contingent, you can just leave it.
Mm.
You can just leave it because it's not essential.
Okay. So it's not
And
saying
so,
it's like so it's working within a specific uh if I'm getting this right, right? If it's working within specific tradition, it's using those, like, its value system to it's saying it's within that value system. It's working within it, but it's contextualizing each way that this is understood according to the time period that
yeah, but
that we're in.
some of that might be not essential to that religion or society or culture. It just happened to be because of the historical time period they were in. That was
Mm.
just happened to be part of that culture, religion, or society. Can you see?
Yeah, so
It's
it's not
becoming
like
even more.
specifically saying, like, the those values are absolutely subjective and they have no basis. Historicism can work within, like, accepting certain values, but it'll say on a
Yeah,
caveat
as
that
essential, it can.
okay.
Yeah, it
Mm.
can. Now, all these features that I just mentioned about historicism, and I can, talk about at length, but I just thought I'll give you some key ones. How does this relate to Islamic modernists now? What's the
Mm.
link between Islamic modernism and historicism? Well, the way I see it is like this, that rather than, remember I said that one of the features of Islamic modernism is they have a break from the past. They're discontiguous from the past because the past is not an authority for them. right? Whereas for traditionalists, it's all about the past. If you want to go forward, according to traditionalists, you have to go back to the past, because in the past, along with the tradition, you have your ideal, you have your solutions.
Could you repeat that again? Sorry, I think you cut off for a second.
So remember I said at the beginning that one of the features of Islamic modernists is that they're discontiguous from the past. They have a break from the past.
Yeah.
Because the past is not the authority, right? They got there via conclusion, some reasoning and some ideas, and these are the ideas from historicism. Now, according to traditionalists, it's all about tradition and the past. To go forward, you have to go backwards. That is the traditionalist mantra. For traditionalists, you've got to hold on hard to the past, because in the past is your ideal. That's where your solutions are. The solutions from your religious sources, your scriptural sources, and the tradition and the interpretations that of those sources over time, based on the authority of the ulama and so on. So Muslim modernists look at modernity not as a bad thing, rather they look at it as a new vista for reimagining religion, or you could say re-enchanting again, i.e. bringing back religion again. Okay. Now, so how does this historicism and Islamic modernism relate? So historicism, as I explained, refers to that approach of understanding historical events and contexts. To understand events of the past based on their historical space-time context. Yeah. Now, Islamic modernists want to say that we then need to now go and adopt this approach of going back and interpreting Islamic past, to see what is essential and what is merely historically contingent, i.e. what is essential to Islam and what is not essential to Islam. Why? Because anything that's not essential to Islam, i.e. anything that's not timeless, like a timeless principle of Islam, and it's just historical contingent, it falls under historical contingencies, then that could be reformed, that could be changed. In fact, that could just be left. We don't need it.
SubhanAllah.
And
so they're not like, specifically like that actually makes things a lot like more clearer when you view it through the way you're describing with historicism. So it's not like they're entirely like saying that, oh, it was all subjective and we're going to leave it forever. We don't need the Quran or Sunnah or anything like that. They're not like a Marxist or atheist specifically.
Modernists are not like that. No. We're talking about 19th century modernists like Jamaluddin Afghani, Sayyid Amir Ali in India. Yeah. So we're talking about, Muhammad Abdu in Egypt. Well, they're not trying to say they want Islam, and they want Islam, but
they view it a specific way.
The approach that they're adopting is via that kind of historicism, that they want to say, we want to look at what is essential to Islam and what is not. Whatever's not essential to Islam, like the tradition, like interpretations, like practices, if these are found to be historically contingent, then we can let go of it. We shouldn't be like the traditionalists, the modernists say, that want to hold on to everything from the past. Now, by doing that, by rupturing yourself from the past, i.e. by breaking yourself away from the past, from what is not essential to Islam, you can undergo a process of deconstructing and then reconstructing. You can look at what is immutable and what are not immutable. So by doing that, modernists can advocate for a return to what they perceive as original and pure essence of Islam, and what is not original and pure essence of Islam. So for them, a lot of the historical contingent material are like the fiqh the fiqh output, or interpretations of the Quran.
The usul.
So in order to then, going back to one of the aims of authentic revival, in order to get that authentic revival, historicism allows Muslim modernists a framework for expunging or freeing Islam as they see it from accretions or historical misinterpretations or mistakes or analysis, whatever it might be. By going back to the essence of Islam, modernists want to purify Islam for what they saw was like accidental stuff, cultural stuff that were backward, superstitious. It crept in over the centuries because no one critically examined these things. Can you see? And so in that way, modernists were seen as countering Orientalist narratives of Islam being static. The traditionalists have fossilized Islam. They're not resistant to change, adaptation and modification. So via this employment of historicism, Muslim modernists can counter these Orientalist narratives, demonstrating that Islam had a rich history of intellectual cultural dynamism, it's based on reason, it's reason-friendly, etc., etc.
Yeah, all of these things is like has like what was the saying of I think Ali Radiallahu anhu, is like a statement of truth, but you're intending by it something false. So there's like
they're going even more. Yeah.
So it's
sorry,
it's very interesting. No. It's I just want to say like so taking it to like Shaykh Yusuf Nabhani's works, like subhanallah, he had mentioned he was quoted as saying like these modernists, they're more like they're probably one of the biggest threats to the deen, the biggest threats to Islam at the time. So it's very like he had like really scathing like critiques of them, but now it's like it's becoming like a little bit more clear, where it's like
so for Imam Yusuf Nabhani radiallahu an, how you have to reaffirm your Islamic identity, right? But how would you do that?
What is
your
Islam?
dignity,
What is Islam? That's the question. Like how are you going to understand Islam?
For them, that was wrapped up with tradition, right? That was wrapped up with everything that had come up until modernity. So the way to reaffirm your identity was to keep hold of your tradition. Now, for the modernists, using historicism, the historicism approach, how would you reaffirm your Islamic identity in the face of modernity or the contemporary time? Well, you would frame your identity will be anchored in the eternal principles of Islam, but not the historical contextual living out of Islam of the past. Can you see? The way you affirm your identity as a Muslim, not through clinging to the past. That's not how you do it. But by clinging to your eternal principles and then showing how your religion can approach contemporary issues, with solid solutions. So you're not going to the past. Your religion has all the intellectual resources you need to address the current situation. You don't have to go to the past, ulama or traditions to help you solve that. So the identity and dignity of Islamic civilization is built, according to the modernists, by this reinterpretation, this reframing. Can you see? By embracing rationalism, because Islam allows you to embrace reason, embracing technology, because Islam allows you to embrace technology, to adopt the new structures and systems, because Islam doesn't prevent you from adopting these new structures and systems, because the ones in the past are historically contingent. They're not part of the essential, timeless, immutable aspects of Islam.
So, like, the reason why I also kind of transitioning a little bit more into some of the modernist, like, political philosophies. The reason why I mentioned, like, Ilm al-Kalam before was it seems like many of the modernists, or at least Abdu, he strengthened certain opinions that would, like, he strengthened in his views a particular worldview, a way of understanding the world that was more in line with like scientific what's it called, the scientific method in his understanding. Which I mean, like for example, for Ash'aris and Maturidis, right? Then I mean, all like everybody would agree that basically, what's going on right now as a normal thing is like if water boils at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, then this is just like a custom. If fire is burning something, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who is basically allowing it to burn. So if Ibrahim alayhi salam goes into the fire, then he comes out fine because it's under the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what's interesting is that like the political philosophy that was coming out of Europe, it's built on that mechanistic understanding, right? That everything can be boiled down
yeah. I get what you're
hard line
saying.
into
Absolutely.
like
Yeah.
laws of nature. So that's why I kind of brought that up. So Muhammad Abdo, he also like had the idea that miracles, from what I'm understanding, he denied like things like miracles, and he's more importantly, his focus was on the like affirming a natural constant law, which is like of course Muslims never had any problem with scientific exploration, but like he puts that like very center at as kind of the foundation for a political philosophy that supports a historicismist worldview where things can be incrementally improved. So just like incrementally before we didn't know that you can take water and make a steam engine. Today we can take the society that was there in the past, maybe at the time of the Ottoman Empire or before, we can incrementally improve on it to make something which is a better world, closer to a utopia. So that's kind of like the jump that I'm seeing
No,
there.
now I get it. Sorry if it wasn't clear for me before. You're absolutely right. And now this brings us to the point that you mentioned about what's the relevance for debate discussion now. Well, it's the same thing regarding that century and a half ago, tension. How much I guess the way you can put it is, imagine you've got, a broken shed, just to give a simple example, right? A shed, it's broken.
Okay.
The traditionalist would say the current tools that I've got in my toolkit, my toolbox, that's going to be what I'm going to use to mend or fix my shed. The modernists would say, no, the tools available now to fix my shed, I'm going to use those. So what I'm trying to say with this analogy is that the question now becomes, as it was asked by those who lived at the time, whether you're traditionalists or modernists, they knew the time that they were living in. Of course they did. But they were approaching it in different ways. So the question now becomes the same now for the Muslim Ummah now. To live in the current age, how is it, what modality are you going to adopt? Is it the traditionalist position where you adopt the tradition and you hold fast to it and everything that it represents? Or do you take the modernist position where no, we examine what is essential about Islam, timeless, immutable, everything else that's not, we can put it aside. We can put it aside. Or is it a mixture of the two, or is it something else? Everyone's going to have a stance on it. This is why it becomes so important. What is it about Islam that is permanent, timeless, immutable, unchanging? And what is it about Islam that we can dispense with? Or not that we can dispense with, but is not relevant or is not something binding for us now. How big you draw each circle is going to depend on what approach you take. So, for example, I'll end my comments on this. Take the idea of the Khilafah, for example. We talked about the Pan-Islamist vision, right? From the Sultan, that Shaykh Yusuf al-Nabhani was part of. The Pan-Islamism legacy manifests in political movements that are trying to restore the Khilafah again. You got this idea of intellectual revival. How do we bring back, the Islamic worldview in a confident way that challenges the sort of other ideologies and worldviews. And how do we now restore this khilafah? If indeed we are supposed to, the Pan-Islamists say we do. We have to bring back this powerful obligation, this necessary institution, as that will unify the Muslims, give them a global identity, solidarity, etc., in the face of, their enemies and so on. Now, what about if you take the modernist approach? You would say, perhaps, hang on, the restoration of the Khilafah is not a paramount obligation. Having the central authority under the singular leadership of one man, one caliph, for all the Muslims is not a desiderata. It's not even an obligation. Why? Because that institution was historically contingent. When we go back to the Islamic sources, we do not see a caliphate. We don't see the Quran giving us the model of the caliphate. And even if the Prophet did have the structures of what would later be the caliphate, that was just historically contingent. That was a contingency for his time. The Prophet didn't come with a normative political structure. So therefore, if the Prophet didn't come with a normative political structure, then we can adopt the current political structures and apparatus, so long as they are in accordance with the timeless principles of Islam. Can you see the difference between the two?
Yeah, it seems like, the main thing is like, it seems methodology, and I feel like really the modernists, they have like a tough time, I would assume, I mean, I haven't read too much about it, but I would assume like, it just becomes like too difficult, too much like a ghost to like pin down, their methodology. How do you say this is specifically pinned to a time period? How do you say that this is like, just a custom and the way that they fulfill it during their time?
Method. Again, historicism has a hermeneutic method, as I alluded to. Remember, you're going to analyze the past in a way that, you're going to you're going to differentiate between what is essential and what is accidental.
See, but
you're going to use that historical critical method.
Okay, so it's like
identify,
because there is like, like some of the like there's that discussion around urf in like usul al-fiqh, if I remember correctly, right? But it's like certain things you could say they're part of urf, they're part of custom, and it's taken into consideration. But other things like, they wouldn't be considered part of urf. That would be considered like, maybe this is the way that you actually implement the ruling, right? So if it's like in the absence of somebody pointing out and explaining, for example, in a book or in some like, mass reported sayings, that this is like, the methodology in which we deal with these situations. In the absence of that, you'd have to basically posit it yourself. So it'd be like, I feel like the modernists would have like, a tougher time substantiating that this in fact is where we delineate between the actual ruling that's there, like and this is the actual ruling, and this is the custom or the mean that it was done in this time period. It seems like, a difficult challenge where it's like, I'm no like I haven't really read too much into the topic of like usul al-fiqh, inshallah later on, but with the traditionalists, I feel like they would have a more robust argument because it's all based on a specific approach to the understanding of the language that they're saying is like passed down through like, many ulama, and a kind of like a peer review type of system between these ulama, affirming and critiquing each other that this is the correct use of this ruling, that you can allow this to happen, you can't allow this to happen, and so on and so forth. So that's one of the things I'm noticing with the modernists. It becomes like water, wavy. It seems like, whatever they can make an argument for can basically be the correct understanding. It doesn't seem like it's bound by many rules or structures, like methodologically.
Yeah, again, this is a hermeneutical, methodological difference between they mutually exclude.
Mm.
The modernists and the traditionalists are mutually exclude each other when it comes to their approaches. Modernists would argue for immense changes in Islamic law and social practices that are in line with what they see are the timeless values of Islam. And so they would say, the modernists would say, we're not abandoning our Islamic heritage. We're just updating our laws, policies, and practices in accordance with our eternal principles of our religion. And we're not bound by the interpretations of the past. So, and in fact, modernists argue that the fiqh, the codified fiqh, really stagnated and stifled progress. This is one of Muhammad Abdu's arguments.
Yeah. Very commonly
That
repeated till today, and like by so many
yeah,
other
yeah.
speakers. I know we're kind of coming to the end of our time here, but I just have one more question for you if you have
Sure.
yeah, Jazakallah khairan. So like one of the things I found interesting was even from the traditionalists, like you have maybe you would have traditionalists that are really like more dogmatic. Just because it's been passed down, they would just stick with this. But that's not like the case for all traditionalists like we've been talking about here. However, when I was doing my research, it seems like some of the sultan's administration from the Ottomans themselves and some of the ulama at that time, they felt that their madaris, their education system, was not it was not like up to the task of the problems that are faced today,
Yeah.
the intellectual challenges. And in a lot of ways, many ulama today that would say firmly themselves, and I mean, you can see themselves, they're not from like, a modernist camp. They are strictly like, they have that affinity and that like, tie to that traditionalist methodology. And they still complain about the sorry state of, education system today in madaris. And of course, there are many people that are trying their best to remedy this problem, to really do that proper tajdeed. Um, so, can we kind of like talk about that maybe a little bit briefly? Some
Yeah.
ossification in the
This is a
madaris.
huge. Yeah, this is a huge topic. You see, it's gonna go back. This discussion is going to go back to what is an Islamic educational system for?
Mm.
Right? What's its purpose? Then the question becomes is, if once you want, whatever that purpose is, whatever you understand it to be, is the pedagogy, is that something divinely instituted? I.e.,
Mm.
there's a Sharia ordained way that you must teach someone? Or is this something that is open to whatever fulfills the best styles and means to attain those Islamic objectives when it comes to the Islamic educational system?
Yeah, and it
So
seems like
this is
there's
the
been that.
discussion at the moment.
Yeah, there's
Sorry?
been that kind of like debate. It seems from the earlier like generation as well. Like I mean, Imam Abu
Yeah.
Hanifa, radiallahu anhu, his method was more like he encouraged his students to kind of debate and make their case among one another. Where it's like some of the ulama, they saw that his students were arguing in the masjid or like raising their voice in the masjid. They're like, why are they doing this in the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So this is going to help them build their fiqh, their understanding. Imam Malik radiallahu anhu is like gatherings were maybe like more solemn and quiet, where of course he's teaching his students, but he didn't want to teach it in that way. So there's that divergence even from this golden generations.
Yeah. So then it now becomes, and this was what one of the aspects of modernity, wasn't it? This is one of the contestations that the modernists had with the traditionalists: educational reform, wasn't it? Was the
Yeah.
traditional curriculum and pedagogy up to the task of, fulfilling? Was it up to the task of addressing the needs of Muslims in the face of modernity. So we're having this discussion now as well. And I think, it's worth, devoting some time, I think, could be a series possibly on this. And I think this is very, very pivotal. I think this is very, very pivotal. And, so go on.
It is a bit telling that, even more than 100 years later, we have to go back to many of these conversations. I mean, even you can go back to conversations 500 years ago. You should always go back and gain something from looking at the past and the works of scholars in previous generations. But it seems like this is a problem that, inshallah, we will continue to, that people will need to address, inshallah, and then, whatever we can do.
Because it's a good testing case.
Piece by piece.
It's a good testing case of what you take to be timeless about Islam and what you don't. Can you see? Because that would be a good way to try and a good case study to see where someone thinks what practices are historical when it comes to pedagogy, teaching, learning, and that. What is historically contingent? What does Islam require? What is necessary and what is historically contingent? And where you draw the line and where you position yourself, or how you answer that question, it will probably be a good way of knowing what you take to be timeless and what you take to be historically contingent. It's a good case study. Is sitting in a circle, is that a Sharia ordained way of learning? Is a Sharia ordained way, is there a 1 hour, 2 hour Sharia ordained time for a particular lesson? No. Right? How a classroom is arranged, is that a Sharia ordained way, a mandated way of organizing a classroom, right? Do you have tables in rows? Do you even have tables? And so, can you see? So it becomes a good test case for how one thinks about these issues. And then you can replicate that for lots of other issues.
It would definitely be very, throughout the centuries, throughout time immemorial, it seems like, the foundation of Tajdid was always it stems from education. And maybe you can make this argument from, different civilizations. I'm sure you can make that statement as well, right? Like today, for better or for worse, I would say probably worse, that we're living in the after effects of the Enlightenment project, right? And that was founded first from a specific epistemology, a specific cosmology, a specific way of understanding things, which is all intellectual at the first, but then it offers a framework for people to work within, and then that eventually went out throughout the world. So likewise, it was the same thing, maybe not exactly same thing, but I mean, the point I'm trying to get at is that education and the way that you're understanding the world is the foundation for development, any type of development, any type of construct. Inshallah, I think it would be great if maybe we could discuss pedagogy in the Muslim world, or kind of how that developed and what are the things that we're the state of it today as well.
I think the Islamic education system, I don't know anyone who's talking about it in the popular Islamic media outlets. What is the whole purpose of an Islamic educational system? What are aspects that are Sharia mandated, what aren't? What things can be adapted, modified, and what things can't, what things are fixed when it comes to the Islamic educational system.
Sure. All right. Inshallah, I think then, it would be great if you could come on and speak with this again, but in the interest of, our time, inshallah, Jazakallah khairan for taking out your time to begin with, to, speak about this discussion with us. Jazakumullah khairan for all of you that are tuning in. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mercy on Shaykh Yusuf Nabhani. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase his status in akhirah.
Ameen, ya Rabb.
Inshallah, we'll catch you guys next Friday for another interesting discussion. Until then, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
لا لن يطول الظلام ديننا لن يضام نحن جيل الهمام نحن فينا عمر لا 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 لن يطول الظلام ديننا لن يضام نحن جيل الهمام نحن فينا عمر صبح بدا نور ظهر نجم وشمس وقمر ألقى على الدنيا الدرر هذا عمر هذا عمر كل البرايا تنتظر أيامه البيض الغرر كي تستفيد من العبر هذا عمر هذا عمر لا لن تدوم الجراح بل سيأتي الصباح نحن أهل الكفاح نحن فينا عمر لا لا لن تدوم الجراح بل سيأتي الصباح نحن أهل الكفاح